In this episode, we will explore Russia's involvement in World War I, and we will begin now. Russia joined World War I in 1914 because of its commitments to the international community. In 1907, Russia had joined an alliance with Britain and France called the Triple Entente. The Triple Entente had formed as a response to the Triple Alliance, which was a military union of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now, competition between these two alliances erupted into war in 1914. And when Austria declared war on Serbia, a country that Russia had promised to support against Austrian aggression, Russia was drawn into the war against Austria and its ally, Germany. Because Russia's transportation system was so undeveloped, 2 weeks were needed to mobilize Russian troops and move them to the Russian-German border. Germany felt the mobilization was like an act of war and therefore declared war on Russia on August 1st of 1914. Tsar Nicholas II took control of the army. He left St. Petersburg, which was renamed with the Russian name Petrograd because Petersburg was a German name, and the Tsar joined his troops at the front. Despite Russia's early successes, during which time Germany was mostly fighting France in the West, both Germany and Austria began to stem the tide of Russian victory. By late August, Germany's army scored a huge victory at the Battle of Tannenberg, in which Russia lost 170,000 soldiers. Though Russia had a periodic success against Austria from late August 1914 until the end of the war, Russia suffered a series of losses. Russia's transportation problems made it really difficult to transport guns or ammunition or supplies to the front lines. By 1915, Russia's supply of rifles was exhausted, and troops were forced to fight with clubs until weapons were freed by a comrade's death or injury. More troops were needed to make up for Russia's lack of hardware, so peasants were drafted into the army. By the end of the war, Russia had mobilized nearly 15 million soldiers. The Tsar spent nearly the entire war at the front. So the Tsarina, Alexandra, controlled the day-to-day activities of domestic government. She was heavily influenced by an illiterate, homeless, itinerant, self-proclaimed monk nicknamed Rasputin, which means dissolute. He earned his nickname because of his adulterous habits. Rasputin earned the Tsarina's devotion because he was able to, quote, miraculously cure her son Alexei's pain caused by hemophilia. Rasputin was given great authority by the Tsarina, and he took advantage of his position to engage in wild orgies and to favor corrupt members of court. Life in Petrograd became completely out of control, with scandal after scandal creating in the populace great disgust with and uncertainty toward the Russian government. Against the backdrop of military failures and political chaos, Russia's common people became fed up with the war and the Tsar's government. Peasants in the countryside were unhappy with the lack of markets for their goods. Workers and people living in cities grew tired of the lack of food and goods in the stores. Soldiers became more and more despondent at the lack of weaponry and supplies, along with the mounting military losses. During the war, Russian losses averaged 30,000 persons per month. By 1917, hundreds of thousands of troops were deserting the front and returning home to their villages. Nobles and intellectuals were frustrated by the lack of initiative and action in Petrograd. Russia suffered the most devastating losses of any country in World War I. By the time Russia was out of the war, it had relinquished huge tracts of land in the West to Germany. Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and Romania all took land from Russia as a result of the war. The war cost Russia billions of dollars in loans, property destruction, and military expenses. More significantly, Russia suffered tremendous casualties during the war. 1,650,000 Russian soldiers were killed. 3,850,000 were wounded, and 2,410,000 were taken prisoner. We're going to skip this slide for now. So why was Russia failing by 1917? Well, 90% of the Russian population was incredibly poor. There was massive hunger across the country. The Tsar was incompetent and out of touch. There was an economic crisis being caused by World War I. The government corruption and scandals with regard to Rasputin and the Tsarina. Tsarist terror with his secret police forces and brutal repression tactics. The crushing losses in World War I. And a growing ideology, the ideology of communism, began appealing to the masses. This leads to what we call the February Revolution. Discontent among Russians caused by shortage, the lack of leadership and stability, and all of those other things on the list we just looked at, led to, spontaneously, a revolt in 1917. On Thursday, February 23rd, it was International Women's Day, and many women took to the streets of Petrograd to demand bread and peace. Though demonstrations and marches were common during the war, this one quickly grew into a widespread revolt. By Sunday, the 26th, soldiers and sailors had joined factory workers in the streets, and even some of the Tsar's palace guards had joined the street mobs. On Monday, the 27th, masses of male and female troops and workers marched on the palace, which was home of the Duma. Many members of the Duma feared that the revolutionaries were coming to lynch them, but instead, they were looking to the Duma for leadership. Liberals and radicals in the Duma rushed out to join with the crowd and led their chants of "Down with the monarchy! Peace now! Bread for all!" The evening of the same day, a meeting of the Petrograd Soviet was called at the Tauride Palace. Socialists took advantage of the confusion caused by the February Revolution to reconvene the Soviets, which had not met legally since the 1905 revolution. The Petrograd Soviet quickly became the true center of authority in revolutionary Russia, because most workers and soldiers looked to it for leadership. Duma members who had accepted the revolution were aware that they could do nothing without the support of the Petrograd Soviet. Soon, Soviets across Russia were electing representatives to go to Petrograd. The Soviet in the capital was renamed the Executive Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, and they assumed the leading role in the revolution in the eyes of most workers, soldiers, and eventually peasants across Russia. On February 27th, liberal members of the Duma formed a provisional committee to respond to the disintegration of the Tsar's government. The purpose of the committee was to restore order and establish contact with public organizations and institutions. Eventually, the committee was renamed the Provisional Government, and its restated aim was to see Russia through World War I. From the very beginning, the provisional government competed with the Petrograd Soviet for control in Russia. Neither group was able to suppress the other or wanted to relinquish power to its rival. So characteristically, Tsar Nicholas II realized the severity of this revolution far too late. While the revolution spread throughout Petrograd and across Russia, the Tsar had remained at the front, communicating with the Tsarina. She was as oblivious to the level of discontent in Russia as her husband was, and repeatedly cabled him with the message that everything in the capital was stable, at the same time that people are taking to the streets in revolt. On Tuesday, February 28th, the Tsar left the war front for Petrograd, finally realizing the extent of the revolt. His train could not make it to Petrograd, though, because workers had seized the railroads. He decided he would accept a constitutional monarchy, but the time for compromise had passed. Even his most loyal generals admitted that all was lost for the Tsar. On March 2nd, the Tsar signed a proclamation of abdication in his royal railroad car. He assumed his brother Michael would become Tsar, but Michael understood very well the hostile feelings Russians harbored toward the Tsar and refused the position. The Romanov dynasty had come to an end. Alexander Kerensky dominated the provisional government. Kerensky was an energetic lawyer who had long been a member of the Socialist Revolutionaries, a radical Russian political party. Because of defections from the provisional government, Kerensky rose from the position of Minister of Justice to Minister of Defense to Prime Minister. Kerensky was also a member of the Executive Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, which gave him great exposure and influence with many different groups in Russia. Kerensky's most important decision was to keep Russia in the war. Influenced by members of the Cadet Party, Kerensky hoped to gain land from the Allies in exchange for continued participation in the war against Germany. Kerensky's decision, though, alienated him from soldiers and other Russians who were sick of Russia's defeats in the war. But most importantly, resumption of the war effort was unpopular with the Petrograd Soviet. So at this time, after the February Revolution or March Revolution, depending on which calendar you're looking at, the Bolsheviks, who were the more radical party, and the Mensheviks, the more moderate party, began to vie for control of Russia. And that provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, decides to stay in World War I, despite it being so unpopular. Our next episode will focus on the Bolshevik Party.